I think when Anthony saw him, win that fight, he just kind of like, this is cool, man. I'm excited for him. Let's ride off of his momentum a little bit. Let's see what we can get in.
I remember a few years back when I was talking to Anthony, he hadn't even released any information yet to the media that he was thinking about coming back. And I think at the time he was doing the interview from somewhere in West Virginia when he was bodybuilding or doing these powerlifting meets.
Yeah.
And I brought up that knockout with Glover. And I remember what he said, because from my perspective, that knockout, I'll always remember the tooth flying.
Right.
Rumble catches him and it goes flying. And Rumble was, even then, he's always been really mindful of not wanting to make anyone look bad. Because I remember that was my first, getting to know Rumble Johnson. And I remember thinking, wow, man, that's not who I thought he would be. And he impressed me a lot, and we stayed in contact. But I could tell then he was admirable of what Glover's career had turned into then. And now I can only imagine what it's evolved into as a champion at 42. Really amazing stuff.
It's amazing, dude. I got excited for that. I love Jan too. Like Jan's
exactly.
Like he's
our age. I mean, I'm 39. He's 38, I think.
Yeah, something like that.
The old guys.
He had a surge there where I think he went like 9-1, and I think his last loss was like Corey Anderson back in 2015, 16 or something like that. And then
avenged it. And then he avenged that one. And
it's just knockout.
It's almost like you get to this stage. I don't know how, maybe you could relate to it from a physical and also an academic level. But from my perspective, as I'm maturing, what I'm learning about, what I'm interested in, what I'm learning about my physical body, going into my late 30s, now April will be my 40th, is that even with my sporting background, education background, I don't know if this is ego, my personal opinion about myself, but I still feel that I've never peaked in anything. Even looking back on the performance field, like, playing different sports, I never sit back and like, damn, man, I wish my body could do that again. Because in my eyes, I haven't yet even squeezed all my potential physically out of myself yet. So when I see guys like Blachowicz and Glover, I'd have to think that science is evolving. The correlation with having our minds being aligned with the potential and our physical attributes, it's like we're still learning from a science perspective too about output.
I think that's a big thing, right? Even if maybe our physicality isn't necessarily improving, but our mental space is improving, like that's still a win, especially in a sport that's very strategic driven. Like the amount of strategy that goes into that, the amount of reaction, the amount of executive function, the amount of higher order items on the brain and skills that you're learning and assessing and doing over time. It's like, those things in combination with, like you said, just still at least maintaining your physical potential, if not maximizing it. It's like, and you're seeing it in this sport.
Oh, dude, even like the power of the belief. And in 2016, where Tristan and I first interviewed you on our first podcast, we would say things like self-belief and say things like mindset. And 16 was only 5 years ago, but shit, that's half a decade ago. And we all know in the world of sports performance, 5 years is like a lifetime in terms of research, development, what we understand. And to see how those variables now have so much sort of relevance in somebody's like performance is really awesome. To even watch Jan when he won the title, how he carried himself changed late into his 30s. Granted, he had the belt, but it's like, man, if you could educate these young fighters or inexperienced fighters to be able to tap into that sort of understanding that you can accomplish before you've accomplished. And I know some fighters say they've done that and that's why they've succeeded. But I mean, Blachowicz was on a loot, like you mentioned, the 8-1 and the 9, but he had lost. He had lost what, 3 out of his first 4?
Yeah, like I feel like he was like every other there at the beginning.
Yeah, getting indifferent. Did he fight it middleweight? I'd have to look, but I know he took. If you look at his losses, there's some guys on there that aren't championship caliber. No offense to anybody, you would never expect them to be title holders.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he's talking about Polish power, and maybe that's the power of people supporting you too. Like maybe that goes into those studies they've done on life expectancy and being around people who love us and how that affects us. But it's really a lot of storylines are being played out in the sport that you've helped craft out, especially down in South Florida now. Yeah. And even this weekend with your boy, with the Chandler fight in Gaethje, man, who knows what to expect?
Dude, I mean, it's going to be fireworks. You know that. I think I was just watching the countdown a little bit, and Chandler even made a comment like, I'm willing to go out on my sword, on my shield. Somebody's getting finished.
When he says things like that, you're around him. When he says things like that, does he mean that?
He means it. He means it.
That's almost like how intimate is that though? Like when you think about,
but me and Rumble were just talking about this too. Rumble's like, the first time I ever saw Michael Chandler, it was in South Florida. It was down here at Hard Rock. He was fighting Eddie Alvarez for the first time, and won fights. That. Yeah, and won that fight. And Rumble's kind of talking about, I think he was with Michael Johnson, is who they went to watch the fight. And Michael Johnson kind of said, hey, this is a Missouri boy. I'm telling you, he's a lot better than what people are giving him credit for. And but you go back to even those fights and look at him back before he really developed all the skill and the striking set that he has now, that he was willing to be literally he's willing to do anything to win that fight and to do those things. And so I truly believe him. He's a guy that in his mind is willing to risk everything for the reward. He doesn't care. Like that's his motto. He's okay. He's willing to take that risk to reap those benefits and what's possible out there.
Yeah. What's it, man? I've noticed, I mean, I don't know. I'm sure it's more than you just shaving, but last time we spoke, it would have been in the pre-stages of the first COVID lockdown and nobody knew what to expect. And
right.
now looking at you now, hearing the podcast you did with Joe D, I wasn't aware. Yeah. I love finding things about you, like on the research side that because you almost bask in anonymity. That's a tough word online. And then I love finding stuff about my friends through other sources. Like when you guys were talking about the research you were doing,
right.
the Ultimate Fighter stuff, and you look great right now. You look re-energized, rejuvenated. Is this something? Yeah, man. Is this something that was a conscious decision, or is were you going through? We've all been through shit.
Right.
Was it a decision of yours? Like, all right, I'm going to turn the dial up here. I'm going to focus here, because you didn't post on social media for like a year, or maybe 9 months, and now you come out and you seem great, and it's great to see.
Yeah, I needed that time away from that, to be completely honest. It was one of those things, we've always had this conversation, like, it's just not me. It's not something I enjoy doing. It's not something I want. Now, I will say I kind of got active there a little bit again, just kind of not much, but I had a talk with sort of the people at Sanford and stuff like that, sort of the higher ups. And they're just like, don't look at it as a way, like, basically the conversation was, I was like, I don't like to promote myself. Yeah. I like my work to speak for what I do. I like the results to speak for the quality of the work. I don't like pushing my brand and whatever, that kind of thing.
Self-promoting.
Yeah. And they basically said, okay, if that's the case though, then don't promote yourself. Promote the guys that believe in you, promote the work that you're doing with those guys. Those guys make a conscious decision to put a heartfelt post about you and the work you're doing and the belief that they do. Show them that, that support, where, at first I was kind of like, I feel like the 8 weeks of 3 times a week grinding camp shows them that rather than a thing. But I was like, okay, I can go with that a little bit. And so I've tried to do that a little bit more, but, to be honest, like, why I think I'm so re-energized with this whole thing and sort of the energy, I want to attribute it to the whole thing that we have going down here with Sanford. I mean,
oh yeah, that's what I was getting at, for sure.
Realistically, that's it. And I'll be honest, I would say before the whole form of, the kind of the Sanford coming together and me being hired as their head strength coach and all of that stuff, I was realistically probably doing 20 to 25 sessions a week on top of a full-time job at the university.
Being a professor, yeah. And
right.
researcher too. That's another thing, man. sorry to cut you off, but for
No,
everyone, for any, this people hear these conversations. I think what gets lost a lot from in the fitness world, if you combine the fitness world with human performance, what gets lost are the people that the people follow online because of they either have huge followings, or the people that maybe they don't have such a big profile because they're actually in the ditches researching, and
sure.
that's what you do, man. Being a researcher, literally trying to figure out the crux of what you're into is super, from my perspective, admirable. I look, that means the most to a guy like myself.
I
Because
appreciate
I know I can trust what you tell me.
That's the fun thing too. I was going back to that podcast with Joe D. He was kind of asking me about it, like how the research thing goes. And I made a funny comment. It's like, I go to these conferences. For instance, I have a conference this upcoming weekend through the ISSN, International Society of Sports Nutrition, and the whole focus is combat sports. Well, he kind of asked me what I want to talk about, what I think. And I was like, I'd love to just keep talking about the research. I feel like that's, I can always go talk about periodization and metabolic testing and this, that, and the other things everybody's heard, but I'd rather let them know about the brilliant research that we're coming out with, all of this kind of cutting edge research in the combat sports world, and see where we go. But like, the funny thing about it is I'm going to do that. I'm going to go through that presentation. And like, when I open it up to questions, I know the first thing is going to be like, so what's Kamaru Usman like? So what's, that's the way it always works. It's like the researcher side, but everybody wants to know what it's like in the trenches with these guys and stuff like that. So it's cool.
Yeah. It's, even, it'd be easy. I don't want to say from, somebody chatting with you, I don't want to use the word lazy, but to pinpoint or maybe focus on one of your pupils, focus on a Kamaru, or focus on a Chandler, or an Ongla, or the Martin Windsor. Dude, guys, just go search the Sanford MMA roster. But I'd like to focus on, I look at the body of work from what I've learned from you over the last 5 years till now, and then not so much focus on the individual fighter, but the sport itself and how the fighter is evolving or has evolved. And sometimes, the opposite of evolving, because we get old and break down, in relation to the sport as well. And one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, or at least ask you, is maybe what the sport has evolved into, or where it's going in relation to sort of the evolution of the training that happens, the sparring that happens behind closed doors, that used to, man, look at the whole Michael, when Michael used to put up the footage, you could still find him on YouTube, when the Black Zillions were the Black Zillions. When I think Carrington Banks was in the mix back then, Abel Trujillo, and the sparring looked like these guys hate each other in relation.
That was a tough room to
come into. Dude, I like the list of guys that were there, and then I think some of them might still be with you. And forgive me if they haven't. But now what it's evolved into, and really in a humanities sense, a short amount, not even an eyelash. 5 years is nothing. But in the sports science world, it's a lot. Maybe talk about those contrasts of what the room looked like in 16, and then how smart, or maybe how evolved the science has gotten into preserving these top-notch guys in hopes of them becoming champions, such as we see a 42-year-old Glover. Maybe talk about that jump.
Sure. So, and I guess kind of go back and answer, I don't think I've quite finished that, my revival. I was doing 25 a week, and now it's less than 10 for sure. So that right there in its own right, like the amount of energy that I have to provide to these guys is much better. Now, again, it's a shift. So I guess that's now to answer your question, that paradigm and that shift. First, talking about strength and conditioning. So we've really aborted the one-on-ones. I mean, that stuff, with the exception of like Kamaru when he's in town, for the most part, we're team-based. Like, and that's another thing for me, a revival from coming from football, coaching college football, being in that team environment. It's been a crazy transition. And, right now I'm actually analyzing the results from our first year sort of block of this, of being more team-based. We probably have a minimum of 10 fighters per group. So it's competitive. That's the thing, less specialized, less individualized, much more competitive in terms of where these athletes are progressing and stuff like that. So from my perspective, that's been something that's been a big change. But I guess to answer globally, what I think, at least what I'm seeing in our gym, we've become a team. Like, it's become a team sport. Everything that we have in place, from our sports medicine staff to our physical therapy to our sports nutrition to our strength and conditioning and performance sector that I'm overseeing to our actual training. It's not just Henry overseeing all striking now. Now he has 3 assistant striking coaches working underneath him as well. We have Greg Jones, who's obviously been the head of our wrestling. Now, in his case, we took Nick Lentz, who just retired. Nick Lentz is one of our coaches now. Kami Barzini. The list goes on and on. So it's evolved into, realistically, this team sport. Obviously, as much as it's sort of unwritten, Henry's at the helm for sure, and that trickles down. That's the way it works. But we're different now. There was a point in time 5-6 years ago where we were starting to write out schedules and think about what's best for everybody. But I noticed those schedules kind of look the same based on what we knew, what we're doing. And now it's the entire schedule for our team is a team-based schedule from Monday till Saturday, what they're doing at the same time. Everybody's doing everything at the same time. With that said, there's much more technique involved now, much more technique-driven practicing, less live. I mean, the sparring sessions they're still intense. Don't get me wrong. Like, our gym it's an intense place to be, but it's more strategy. It's more periodized. We're looking at 4 to 6 week blocks of training based on where people are at in camp, and really, not just from, I feel like there was a point in time where strength and conditioning was the only thing that was really periodizing these camps, because that's what we know. We understand this. Like, we understand how to do those things. But I think it's just like, as all of us have worked together for so long as coaches, every piece of the puzzle is now being progressed and periodized properly. And when volume goes up in one aspect, I'm pulling back, vice versa. And I feel like I was always the one adapting for so long based on everything else that was going on around. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that's wrong or right based on the needs, but now we're all adjusting. Now we're looking at the different waves of volume and intensity and things like that, putting recovery into the piece, actually programming recovery and body work and those kind of things. And it's getting smarter. It's getting more intelligent. We're using the resources that we have. We're using sports science. We're looking at our athletes. We're using not only objective data, but subjective reporting from both coaches and athletes alike to see sort of what their sense is on how the practices are going. And like I said, these are things that weren't being done 5, 6, 7 years ago in this sport. So it's the evolution piece in terms of our team is just far beyond where we were 6, 7 years ago.
It's fascinating that you bring up the team component versus the individual minded component. I could see just on the outside how that would benefit if you're so much focused at camp on one individual fighter, and there could really only be 2 outcomes of a fight unless you have a draw. I could see that individualized system, when a fighter loses, be really detrimental probably to the camaraderie of the overall, whatever the environment is in that locker room. But if that team component has been created and that system is not necessarily about winning or losing in a combat sport, which is really important, but if it's minded over the whole gym and the whole team as performing at a highest level, I can see how that would probably not soften the losses, but help the fighter who does go through a loss ease back into the environment once again, rather than, I can only imagine being a fighter losing and then having to come back to your team, especially when you're that top level, right, and trying to blend back in. If the energy of the locker room, per se, the team, is already like, maybe it's a toxic sort of thing already, how that would be difficult. But
yeah, you're absolutely right about that.
I want to ask about one, I try not to get too specific about fighters, but I love seeing, and this is, I mentioned this to Ongla, we spoke about a month ago before he went with Martin to his last performance. But when I see fighters come down to Sanford, like, because I've been now, I get just as much enjoyment out of watching like the CFFC, the Cage Fury, Cage Warriors. I've been watching, all the amateur up and comers, and I'll get into that in a second on why. But when I see fighters come down to Sanford, I'll then, just my own probably upbringing, being a loyalist, cheer for those guys. And there was a fighter that I wondered, maybe you could answer this, from Brazil, RoboCop, Grigor. He fought on the Contender Series, and the one time he lost, he took a loss, and it was very evident his body type, muscled up, bodied up. I think he middleweight, and he looked dangerous, but then he faded, and then he disappears for a small amount of time, comes back on, and I see Ongla in his corner, and they talked about how he changed camp. I think they said he had changed camps. He'd gone to Sanford. Doesn't lose the intimidating aspect of his game. Doesn't lose the body, but he has cardio now, and he can take a shot. I guess my question is, was he new to Sanford? Am I right when he was new? And then when you get a fighter like that from your perspective, when you see the body type, when you see the body work, and then you see the potential, how did you handle him specifically? And then probably share, if you can, because I know you're a system guy, a system that you have in place on molding that performance around what you already have.
Yeah. So with him, in his case, being new to the team and that kind of thing, I'll be honest, after this last performance, this is the first time he and I have we actually just had to sit down this morning. Like, he was very fast paced. If you look at his thing, so he won the Contender Series, or he won the LFA title with us. That was his first fight with us, bouncing off of the Contender Series. And then right away, he got a 1 week short notice fight with the UFC, won that, had another fight, just had they just announced it as fight of the month this last fight.
It was a war.
Battle. And you know what? We've had some guys, we've had guys that actually fought that opponent, and that dude he's so tough. Yes. And I can't believe, I'll be honest, like, finishing him says a lot, especially like the back and forth, the war, the way it went, but like actually finishing that guy. Yeah. I don't think anybody else has done that. I don't think he's been finished.
Grigor looked out on his feet. Like, he looked in trouble in the second. And then in a whole nother side chat, I love how crazy is Ongla. He just goes to all these fights, cornering. Talk about a future coach. He's already been mentoring, but I'm like, get some rest. You're traveling all the time. He loves it.
That's going to be his future. He's going to be a coach and a real estate mongo. That's what he's going to. Those are the two things that he cares about.
Yeah, he's a good dude, man. What a good guy.
Grabbing as much property as he can down here in Florida and helping these guys. That's like his.
That's awesome, man. So with Grigor.
So I'll be honest. Because of his fast pace, his short notices, and things like that, we really haven't been able to do all the stuff that I traditionally like to do when somebody joins the team, to be able to get. So that was actually, we have him scheduled for Friday of this week to finally do our laboratory testing and stuff like that. So, it's one of those things where I'd love to sit here and say, he's a product of the system, the testing and this and that. But like, honestly, no, he's not. He's a product of the strength and conditioning, the group environment, the competition. He's very dedicated to it. He's very loyal. He's very in tune with his physical preparation. I'll be honest with you. He must have had good, and I don't know who they are, to be honest, but he's had some good traditional training in the back. He's in tune with his heart rate monitoring. He's in tune with his journaling and his logging and knowing his volume and understanding those things. So he's really already very good and dedicated in that aspect. I think with somebody like him, it was really just in our situation, pulling back a little bit from some of the very high volume work, some of the very heavy stuff that I think he's traditionally done in the past, and really getting it very basic. I think he's done a lot of Olympic style lifting in the past, a lot of very heavy compound lifting and stuff like that. And just with our short notice and the point that we're at 3-4 weeks out every time, it was like, I remember him saying that to me, like, shouldn't I be doing a little bit more of this? Shouldn't I be doing a little bit more of that? But I'm like, dude, you have 11 other sessions that you're dedicating your time, your energy, and your efforts to at a very high output. Like, we have to rein this in. We have to make sure that we're doing the right amount of work, the right amount of volume, not to influence your sparring day tomorrow and this and that. So I'm really excited to see where we go with him. But, to answer your question, I wish I could say I've been doing something world renowned with him, but in his case, honestly, where I've had him in camp every single time, it's really been like 4 or 5 weeks notice. So working high intensity contrast bouts, a lot of low volume, different contrasting sets, whether we're doing French contrast or we're even more simplistic with it, some rep out schemes, and really very much alactic conditioning work and a lot of bouts of that. And it's seemed that formula, along with the amount of volume that the other coaches are putting on him in sparring and training, has, so far he looks great. And so I would say, I'd love to take the credit for it, but I think it's just a combination of the entire system, the entire Sanford program, that I don't think he's ever been to a place that's been that structured, that organized, and honestly, that tough to survive. It's a tough gym. I mean, you're not getting an easy round ever. That's the thing. You're never getting an easy round.
I was on your website last night, the Sanford MMA, and it goes from brief description, the fighter list, and then the staff. You're on there, obviously, for the head of the science and performance. Right. But I'm going through, and not all the fighters are even on that list. I'm going through the fighters that just have their photos on that list, and I'm like, Jesus. No one, you got to make a choice. You're either going to become friends and as tight as a bond with these guys, or you're not going to last. And I think that in itself has to have a positive benefit for a fighter who's new to that, especially, I like seeing Brendan Allen. He's still there, right?
Yep. Yeah.
I like seeing fun with him. Yeah, young kid, bodied up. I like seeing young up and coming fighters who already have the potential, because it does take an element of trust to buy into a team environment such as that. And I could, and kudos to the fighters who've seen the system work for, not only the good of themselves, because combat can be very ego driven. It kind of has to be. It's like this, but I'm sure on the opposite end of that, some fighters see that and they're probably so intimidated, or the ego gets in the way, and then they bounce to bounce to bounce, and that's camp to camp. Do you guys?
And I think they're not used to it sometimes. Yeah. Like I'll even use Brendan as an example. I think when Brendan first got here, he was always used to sort of that individualized aspect of it, and found a guy on the team that was going somewhere else, and did that for a little while, and now he's fully invested and probably brings brings a lot of energy with him when he comes to those training sessions and in part of that environment and stuff. And obviously now, look, we're preparing for a big one with Brad Tavares. Like that's an awesome fight.
I love Brad, and I'm chubby. I just want to see both of those fighters go out there and give awesome performances. And I'd like, as a fan and as somebody who watches every single fight, one of the things that I'm predicting down the road that isn't a stat or doesn't get spoken about it at all, that I could see is becoming an attributed factor to the success of a fighter and the success of a gym, is the fact that, and I'll tie this into what you bring to the table, very important, is that your fighters all could take shots. And I mean, they say you can't teach toughness, or toughness has, you mentioned the warrior gene that if we have time, we could get into. Yep. But when I see a fighter take a shot, especially a fighter that I've seen fight before, take that same shot in his past and him get knocked out, usually it's the other way around. Usually you see a fighter, we'll use Liddell, the most famous example, used to be able to take a shot, gets clipped, gets shut off a few times, and then that chin's never the same. I'm seeing guys, come through Sanford. One of the most positive factors is the fact that you got to hit your fighters with axes and fire extinguishers, and they're still coming at you. And anyone who knows anything about fighting knows that that's an attribute to having your cut dialed in, your strength and conditioning dialed in, having your awareness of where the shots are coming, the mental prep, all of these things. It's not necessarily just the shot. Now, talk about that. Does that ever get spoken about? I know there's so many variables, but to my original point, do you think somewhere down the road in the future of the evolution of the sport and sports science, that could be something that could be measured? That could be something when you take in, how much does this fighter cut? How much has he been knocked out before? Can he take a hit? Like basically training the fighter to be able to take as much damage in the fight, not in the lead up, but in the fight, and still be healthy and still give himself a fighting chance to be victorious, versus a guy that takes the same shot who might get, knocked out.
I think you bring up a really interesting point. And, I don't know, to answer your question, I don't know if that's something we're going to be able to measure at some point in time. One thing that I will say that we are very conscientious about is that exact aspect. Somebody coming off of a knockout, we never had a return to practice protocol and things like that in the past. Those are things that we now have with a director of sports med, our PT, our staff. Like we have the return to play, and I'll be honest, we're very conservative about it. It's cool to see all of these coaches, guys like Henry and stuff, that have really turned a corner on this and believe in what we're doing, and guys being healthy and longevity and things like that. But, we're very much guys that come off of knockouts and things like that. We're limiting so much of their sparring, the amount of time that they're actually preparing and stuff like that. Like, it's very rare that we're going to see those individuals get more than about 3 to 4 work rounds per week, which isn't normal. A normal Tuesday for us is probably 5 to 6. We're going to pull
5-minute rounds.
Yeah. 5 to 6 rounds on a Tuesday might be something that's relatively normal for our gym. But those guys that, are older in their career and things like that, we're typically pulling them after 2 rounds.
Is that your protocol? Does that all?
Well, it's a combination. I think it's a conversation, between all of us. And I think that's, I think maybe I introduced that idea of like, limiting this and doing those kind of things. But, it's a trend that's kind of carried over. I would say for the most part, any of our fighters that are, hovering that 33 and up age, now we're probably only sparring once a week as well. And we do have 2 days of sparring, on our schedule, on our team schedule. Tuesday is more of our stand-up kickboxing, big glove sparring. Thursday is typically our little glove, full takedown MMA sparring. And based on strategy, based on their fighting style, we typically are going to kind of bounce back and forth with some of those older guys where they're going to get 2 to 3 rounds on Tuesday. Thursday, we have a bag drill, a conditioning session, something set up for those guys to keep them out of the live rounds, and vice versa. The following week, it might be the other way around. So we're really limiting a lot of that head contact. More guys are finally wearing headgear and stuff like that, which is like so brutal,
Well, you got an old Dutch kickboxer running the whole damn show. When you bring up just now that you have protocols, I'm like, you had to probably arm wrestle that guy to bring those in there.
I'm telling you, Henry plays the very simplistic kickboxing guy, but Henry's smart as hell.
Yeah, you can tell.
He fluently, like anybody, he fluently speaks about 5 languages. He communicates with everybody. Like, I'm like, what are you doing in this sport? If you were born here and you could speak 5 languages like you do, like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
But
we're just from Ohio, Corey. We're just Ohio boys. Just be happy with it. We're overachieving.
That's it. That's exactly it. So I laugh, but like, he's really invested in this too. I think as he's evolved and as the team has evolved, and he's sort of, sitting obviously at the top of the team working down, it's like he's been able to delegate more. He's been able to trust people around him more. And I think that environment in its own right has been such a breath of fresh air because, the Black Zillions days and stuff like that, like those were crazy days. Those were wild sparring matches, but like every coach included felt like they were on the chopping block at any given time too. I think that was an environment you had there where that's why like everything you saw come out of that gym was like the craziest, most intense. Like these fighters need to think this was the best session they've ever had in their life. They need to walk out of here feeling dead, or we didn't do our job kind of an environment. I think it kind of got to that point a little bit where you felt very cutthroat. And it was like, it wasn't a comfortable work environment there towards the end where it's like always kind of looking over your shoulder and stuff like that. And so I think now that we're in this environment where it's, and we all get along, that's the other thing as a coaching staff, it's like you make these additions, you bring these people in and you see how they fit in and you see how they're working. And, it's just very, very low egos and very high work output with the group that we have. And it's been a blessing for me to be able to work with these guys and see the different things. I was watching these fights the other day and I was thinking about this conversation that we're having. And I was watching Matt Hughes, BJ Penn. That was the fight I was watching, UFC Unleashed. And, they get into a takedown exchange and you see Matt Hughes immediately pull guard, put him in there. They get into a grappling thing. BJ Penn gets to his back. Like, You don't see that anymore. People aren't pulling guard. They're not doing those kind of things. And like, I can remember 6 or 7 years ago with Greg Jones sort of coming out of that collegiate wrestling style and coming into the MMA world. Obviously, Greg's a 3-time national champion, one of the best wrestlers in college history. But like, I can always remember like thinking about that cutthroat kind of gym where some people would be like, well, you know, he doesn't know MMA wrestling and this and that. And he's out here trying to teach these guys to fight the head and get their hips out and stand up. And like, that's not the way this is. You know, they need to be pulling guard, finding limbs, this, that, and the other. And I look at this evolution, I think where we're at now, and I'm like, everything that everybody is teaching fighters now is what Greg was doing 5 or 6 years ago. Fight the head, fight the hands, get your hips out, sprawl, you know, all of those things. Yeah.